Take it off. His voice didn't rise. It never did. That was the thing about Orion, his quiet was louder than other men's screaming. Or I will. 2 years. 2 years of budget meetings and encrypted files and coffee at 6 a.m., and I had never once seen him look at me like I was something that belonged to him. I had been careful about that. Meticulous, even. The red dress had been a miscalculation. I held his gaze because dropping it would be surrender, and I had not survived 2 years in this man's orbit by surrendering to anything. It's appropriate for the gala, I said. My voice came out steadier than I deserved. You said formal. I said formal. He took one step forward. Just one. He didn't need more than that. I didn't say that. The chandelier light caught the ink at his throat as he moved, and I became suddenly, acutely aware of the marble behind me and the very finite amount of hallway remaining between us. His eyes hadn't left mine. That was almost worse than if they had. You have 30 seconds, Lyra. He wasn't bluffing. He never bluffed. That was also the problem. I changed. Not because he told me to. That was what I kept telling myself as I stood in front of the mirror in the estate's East Wing guest room, a room I had never once used in 2 years of employment, a room that apparently existed solely for occasions like this one, when Orion Crow decided the universe required rearranging. The red dress was folded over the back of a chair, silent and incriminating. In its place, I wore black. A floor-length column of it, high-necked, long-sleeved, impeccable. Something that said nothing to anyone. I changed because the gala started in 40 minutes and I was a professional. That was the story I was keeping. He was waiting at the base of the staircase when I came down. He'd already put himself back together, if he'd ever come apart, which was debatable. Dark suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt open in the only concession to informality Orion Crow ever made. His eyes traveled up from the floor once, the same way they had in the hallway, except this time nothing shifted in his expression. He simply looked at me the way he looked at a restructured ledger. Correct. Acceptable. Back in order. Better, he said. I'm so glad, I said. The corner of his mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile and we didn't speak again until the car arrived. The dress code memo appeared on my desk the following morning. Not an email. A memo. Printed, signed at the bottom in Orion's particular handwriting, the kind that looked effortless and had probably taken years to cultivate. I stood in the doorway of my office reading it while my coffee went cold in my hand, and I read it twice because the first time I assumed I had misunderstood. I hadn't. Effective immediately, all staff attending external functions on behalf of Crow Holdings would adhere to a revised appearance standard. Professional. Conservative. Pre-approved. There was a list. It was thorough. It was, in the technical sense of the word, entirely reasonable, the kind of policy any legitimate organization might maintain for brand cohesion and public representation. Orion had even included a rationale. Security considerations. Visibility protocols. The importance of a unified, controlled presence in environments with elevated exposure. It was also, unmistakably, about the red dress. I set my coffee down on the edge of my desk and looked across the open floor plan toward his office. The glass wall was clear, he preferred it that way, the ability to see everything at once, his own panopticon, and he was already at his desk, already working, already wearing the expression of a man who had made a decision and moved on. His head didn't lift. I picked up the memo. I walked to his door. I knocked once because protocol demanded it and opened it because 2 years had taught me that waiting for Orion to say come in was an optimistic exercise. He looked up. I placed the memo on the edge of his desk, which was the only clear surface in a room full of controlled disorder, files stacked with intent, screens angled precisely, a glass of water he never finished. This is about the dress, I said. It's about professionalism. It's a 4-page document about professionalism that appeared 12 hours after I wore a dress you didn't like. A dress that created unnecessary attention at a function that required discretion. He leaned back. His chair didn't creak. Nothing in Orion's environment was permitted to creak. That's a security concern, Lyra. Not a personal one. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back with the particular patience of a man who had learned that silence was the most effective negotiating tool in any room. I had learned that from him, actually. I used it now. He didn't fill it. Of course he didn't. Fine, I said. I took the memo off his desk. I walked back to my office. I spent the rest of the morning doing exactly what I was paid to do, cross-referencing the Aldecott accounts, drafting 3 letters he would read and sign without comment, scheduling a meeting with the Port Authority liaison that everyone involved would pretend was about shipping logistics. I was efficient. I was invisible. I was exactly what the memo required me to be. I did not think about the hallway. The pre-approval process began that afternoon. In practice, this meant that Marin, Orion's head of household operations, a woman of 60 who had survived 3 different iterations of the Crow Empire and had the posture of someone who had seen everything and filed it, appeared at my office door at 2 p.m. with a tablet and an expression of practiced neutrality. She had been sent, clearly, though she would not say so. She simply explained that going forward, for any external engagements, I was to submit my outfit selection 24 hours in advance. To you? I asked. A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. To the relevant party, she said. I understood. I nodded. Marin left. The relevant party. As though I might somehow be unaware that Orion Crow had implemented a system by which he would personally review my clothing choices before I was permitted to leave his house in them. As though the architecture of it were subtle. As though I hadn't spent 2 years learning to read the subtext of everything this man did, every decision that presented itself as administrative while being, at its marrow, something else entirely. I submitted my first selection at 2:15. A charcoal wrap dress, mid-length, thoroughly unremarkable. I attached no note. I asked no questions. His response came back in 11 minutes. Approved. 1 word. No punctuation. I stared at it on my screen for longer than was strictly necessary, aware of something shifting in my chest that I was not prepared to examine, and then I closed the message and went back to the Aldecott accounts. That evening I stayed late, not unusually late. I often stayed late. It was one of the things that had made me useful to him, and when the floor had emptied and the building had settled into its nighttime quiet, I heard his office door open. Footsteps. The specific cadence of them, which I knew the way I knew my own heartbeat by now, unhurried, deliberate, certain of the ground beneath them. He appeared in my doorway. He had his jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, which was as close to undone as Orion Crow allowed himself in the presence of another person. He looked at my desk, at the files, at the cold coffee beside my keyboard. He looked at me. You should go home, he said. I have the Veltri correspondence to finish. It can wait until morning. You never say that. I'm saying it now. He didn't move from the doorway. Just stood there, filling it the way he filled every room he entered, not loudly, but completely, the way a tide fills a harbor, until there was no remaining space that didn't account for him. His eyes held mine with that familiar, unreadable steadiness. Go home, Lyra. I saved my work. I closed my laptop. I gathered my things with the measured efficiency of someone who was absolutely not affected by any of this, and I walked past him in the doorway with exactly 2 inches of clearance between us. Good night, Orion. He said nothing. But he watched me all the way to the elevator. I felt it on my back like a hand. The charcoal dress was approved. The car arrived at 7. Orion was already inside it. This was new. In 2 years of external engagements, the quarterly dinners, the charity functions, the meetings that weren't meetings, I had always taken a separate vehicle. Staff and principals didn't share transport. It was one of those unwritten protocols that nobody had ever needed to write down because it was simply understood, the way gravity is understood. You don't document it. It just governs everything. He didn't acknowledge the change. He was looking at his phone when I got in, scrolling through something that required his complete attention, or was performing that requirement with enough conviction that questioning it felt foolish. The partition between us and the driver was already up. The city moved past the windows in amber and shadow. I folded my hands in my lap and looked straight ahead. "You'll stay close tonight," he said, without looking up. "I'm your secretary. I'm always close. Closer than that." I turned to look at him. He had put the phone away. He was watching the city now, his profile cut sharp against the window glass, jaw set, the ink at his throat disappearing into his collar. He said it the way he said most things, not as a request, not quite as an order, but as a statement of fact about a reality he had already decided on, and was now simply informing you of. "There are people attending tonight," he continued, "who know what you know. That makes you a liability if you're unaccompanied. And an asset if I'm not." He looked at me then. "Yes," he said simply. "Exactly that." The car stopped. The door opened. And Orion Krause stepped out first, turned, and offered me his hand in the particular way of a man who has decided something privately and is now making it public, one gesture at a time. I took it. Because we were being watched already. Because there were cameras and competitors and a dozen pairs of eyes that cataloged everything that arrived at a Meridian Group gala and filed it for future leverage. Because it was professional. Because it was strategy. I took it, and his hand was warm, and I didn't think about that at all. The gala was held in the Meridian's grand ballroom, which was exactly what it sounds like and worse. Gilt everything. Flowers that cost more than salaries. A string quartet in the corner performing the musical equivalent of expensive wallpaper. The guest list was a careful taxonomy of the city's two parallel power structures, the visible kind, politicians and developers and the old money families who attended these things as a form of territory maintenance, and the invisible kind, who attended for the same reason and smiled the same smiles and were considerably more dangerous. Orion moved through it the way he moved through everything. Without urgency. Without performance. The crowd adjusted around him organically, the same way it always did, that unconscious human recalibration that happens in the presence of someone the body registers as apex before the mind has caught up. People came to him. They shook hands, exchanged words, laughed at the right moments. He was, on the surface, charming in the specific way of men who have never needed charm to get what they want and therefore deploy it sparingly, which makes it devastatingly effective. And through all of it, his hand was at the small of my back. Not gripping. Not possessive in any way that could be named or photographed or reported back. Just present. The flat of his palm against the fabric of the charcoal dress, a point of contact so steady and consistent that within 20 minutes I had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing your own pulse. It was simply there. It was simply him, a warmth that moved with me when I turned, that resettled when I stilled, that communicated nothing to the room except that I was his and the room should understand that and act accordingly. The room understood. The room acted accordingly. I watched it happen with the detached clarity of someone who has spent 2 years learning to observe without reacting. The way men who approached him clocked my position first before they spoke. The way their eyes moved from his face to mine and back with a particular recalculation, not dismissal, not curiosity, but a careful reassessment of variables. The women were more direct. I caught 2 of them watching me from across the room with expressions that were more forensic than social, measuring the distance between his hand and my spine and drawing their own conclusions. I was drawing my own. I just hadn't decided what to do with them yet. It was near the end of the first hour when Dominic Reyes appeared. I knew him from the files. Import-export, legitimately and otherwise. Mid-tier, ambitious, the kind of man who attended events like this as an act of aspiration rather than belonging. He was handsome in an obvious way and he knew it, and he made his approach to me during the single moment Orion had stepped aside to speak privately with the Aldecott Group's financial director, which told me the approach was not accidental. Lyra Solari, he said, as though we knew each other, which we didn't. Krau's secretary. I've heard you're the one who actually runs things. I manage his schedule, I said pleasantly. Can I help you with something? I was hoping we might. She's occupied. Orion was beside me. I hadn't heard him move, hadn't felt the approach, which meant he'd covered the distance faster than the conversation warranted, which meant he'd been watching. His hand returned to my back. The touch was identical to what it had been all evening, unhurried, unremarkable, except that now it pressed, very slightly, and the pressure said everything his voice hadn't. Reyes looked at the hand. Looked at Orion's face. Made a rapid, intelligent series of calculations. Of course, he said smoothly. Another time. He excused himself with the practiced grace of a man retreating without appearing to retreat and disappeared into the crowd. Orion watched him go. I had it handled, I said quietly. I know. Then. I know, he said again, the same words, entirely different meaning, and his thumb moved once against the fabric at my spine, a single slow motion that was so brief I might have imagined it, and then it stilled, and we were simply standing there again, watching the room, his hand at my back, my pulse doing something I was categorically refusing to acknowledge. The quartet shifted into something slower. Stay close, he said. You keep saying that. You keep making it necessary. I looked up at him. He was watching the room still, that familiar profile, that careful jaw, giving me nothing. Giving me everything. The chandelier light moved across the silver threading of his suit and I thought about the red dress folded over the chair in the East Wing guest room and I thought about 11 minutes and one word and no punctuation. Approved. I looked away first. I always looked away first. It was the only way to win anything in proximity to this man, and even then I wasn't sure winning was the right word for what I was doing. The night had a long way left to go. We got back to the estate at 11:43. I know the exact time because I checked my phone in the car, a deliberate act, something to look at that wasn't him. The gala had run long in the way these things always did, the ending more negotiation than conclusion, a slow disentanglement of handshakes and implications that Orion managed with the same unhurried precision he managed everything. By the time we reached the car I had been on my feet for 4 hours and the back of my neck ached and I was carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent an entire evening performing composure. He went straight to his office. I should have gone home. He had told me to go home the night before, which was unprecedented, and precedent in the Crow estate was the closest thing to law. But there was a discrepancy I'd found in the Veltri correspondence that afternoon, a routing number that didn't align with any account I had authorization to access, and it had been sitting at the back of my mind all evening like a splinter, small and specific and impossible to ignore. I told myself that was why I followed him in. His office at night was a different room than it was during the day. The city through the floor-to-ceiling windows was all dark geometry and scattered light, and he hadn't turned on the overheads, just the desk lamp, which threw everything into amber and shadow and made the room feel smaller than its square footage. He had his jacket off already, draped over the back of his chair. The bourbon was out, Blanton's, the good one, which only appeared when the evening had cost him something he wasn't going to discuss. He didn't look up when I came in. I thought I told you to go home. You did, I said. There's a routing discrepancy in the Veltri file. A pause. It can wait. It's been waiting since 3 o'clock. I crossed to my usual chair, the one across from his desk, the chair that had shaped itself over 2 years to the specific geometry of these late conversations, and sat down and opened my laptop. Account ending in 7742. It's not in any of the ledgers I have access to. The quality of his stillness changed. It was subtle, the way all significant things about Orion were subtle, a fractional shift in the set of his shoulders, a stillness that was no longer the stillness of a man at rest but of a man making a rapid private calculation. I had learned to read the difference. I wished, sometimes, that I hadn't. "Leave it," he said. "Orion. Lyra." He looked up. His eyes in the lamplight were very dark. "Leave it." I looked at the number on my screen. I looked at him. 2 years of knowing when to push and when to read the room, and every instinct I had was telling me clearly and unanimously to close the laptop and go home and let the splinter stay where it was. I typed the account number into the secondary search field instead. What came back took me a moment to understand. Not because it was complicated, it wasn't. It was extraordinarily simple, which was its own kind of devastating. A holding account. Established 6 years ago. Collateral documentation attached, and I opened it, and the name at the top of the first page was not a company name or a shell entity or any of the careful bureaucratic architecture Orion used to make money invisible. It was a person's name. My father's name. The bourbon glass came down on the desk. Not slammed, Orion didn't slam things, but placed with a finality that was louder than impact. He was standing now, though I hadn't seen him rise, and he was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not the calculation. Not the control. Something that sat behind both of those things, older and less managed. "How much?" My voice came out very level. I was distantly impressed by it. "How much did he owe you?" "That's not." "How much, Orion?" He told me. The number was not small. The number was, in fact, large enough that I understood immediately why my father had never mentioned it, why there had been a period 3 years ago when things had quietly stabilized in my family without explanation, why I had been hired, chosen, specifically, from a pool of candidates that included people with considerably more experience, to manage the private affairs of the city's most feared man. I closed the laptop. The room was very quiet. Outside the windows the city moved in its indifferent amber sprawl, and the bourbon sat untouched between us, and I was aware of my own breathing in the specific way you become aware of it when everything else has gone silent. "You hired me to collect a debt," I said. "No." The word was immediate. Flat and certain. "My father owed you money and you hired his daughter and you're telling me that's a coincidence." "I'm telling you it started that way." He moved around the desk, not toward me, but away from it, toward the windows, putting his back to the glass and his face to the room, which meant his face to me. The lamplight caught the line of his jaw, the ink at his throat. He looked like a man who had rehearsed a version of this conversation and had just realized the rehearsal was inadequate. "The debt was settled 18 months ago." "It's been settled." "By whom?" A pause that lasted too long. "By me." I stood up. The chair scraped back and I stood there in the charcoal dress in his amber-lit office and looked at the man who had hired me under false pretenses and then, apparently, absorbed my father's debt out of his own accounts, and I tried to locate the correct emotion in the tangle of everything I was feeling. There were several candidates. I couldn't pick one. They were all present simultaneously, which made it difficult to speak, and so for a moment I didn't. "Why?" I finally said. He looked at me. He didn't look away. "You know why." "I want you to say it." Something moved across his face. The careful architecture of him, that controlled and curated surface, showed a crack, not wide, not dramatic, just a hairline fracture through which something true and unmanaged briefly showed itself, like light through a door that opens and closes too fast to be certain you saw it. He crossed the room in 4 steps. He stopped close enough that I had to tilt my chin to hold his eyes, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of bourbon and whatever his suit cost, and underneath both of those things something warmer and less nameable. His hand came up slowly, deliberately, giving me every opportunity to step back, which I didn't take, and his fingers curved around my jaw, the barest contact, his thumb at the edge of my cheekbone. You're not a debt, he said quietly. You were never a debt. The lamp flickered once. The city hummed beyond the glass. His eyes held mine with an intensity that had nowhere left to hide inside it, no calculation remaining, no management, just the unmediated weight of a man who had run out of architecture. I should have stepped back. I didn't step back. The shot came from the east. I know this because Orion moved west, instinctively, instantly, his body between mine and the direction of the sound before my mind had even registered it as a sound. One moment I was standing at the window of the outer office watching the morning arrive in gray increments over the city, coffee in hand, and the next the coffee was on the floor and Orion's arm was across my chest and we were moving, and the window I had been standing at had a new geometry, a splintered star in the upper left quadrant that the morning light was doing something terrible and beautiful through. The security team materialized the way they always did in crisis, silently, completely, from positions I had never been able to map despite 2 years of trying. 4 men. Positions established in under 10 seconds. Marchin, the head of estate security, was on his radio before the glass had finished settling, his voice carrying the particular flat cadence of someone delivering information with all the emotion surgically removed. Orion had not let go of me. We were in the interior corridor, away from glass, away from windows, his hand wrapped around my wrist with a grip that wasn't quite painful and wasn't quite not. He was scanning. That was the only word for it, his eyes moving across the space with a systematic precision that I recognized from boardrooms and interrogations but had never seen applied to a situation where the variable being assessed was my continued survival. I'm fine, I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of it. He looked at me then, for exactly 1 second, and what was in his face in that second was not the expression of a man whose asset had nearly been compromised. Then it was gone, and he was speaking to Marchin, and I was being guided, firmly, efficiently, without my input being solicited, toward the interior of the estate. The private wing was on the 3rd floor. In 2 years I had been in it exactly once, delivering a document that couldn't wait, standing in the doorway while Orion retrieved it from his desk with the particular economy of a man who keeps his private spaces private. It was larger than I'd registered in that brief exposure. A sitting room that managed to be both spare and expensive, the kind of aesthetic that results from buying only things you actually want and wanting things that are very good. A desk positioned to face both the door and the window. Bookshelves that were used rather than decorative. And through an archway, a bedroom door, closed, which I was not looking at. Marin installed me in the sitting room with a composure that suggested this was not the first time she had been called upon to relocate a person of importance to the 3rd floor under abrupt circumstances. She produced tea I didn't ask for, a change of clothes, my size, which I didn't examine the implications of too closely, and the information that my own apartment was being swept by security as a precaution and I would be staying at the estate until further notice. Whose notice? I asked. Her expression was perfectly pleasant. The relevant parties, she said, and left. Orion came up at noon. I had spent the intervening hours doing the only thing that made sense to me in situations I couldn't control, which was working. My laptop was open on his sitting room desk, the Aldecott files spread in their organized geometry, and I was 3 pages into a revised routing analysis when the door opened and he came in still in his morning clothes, no jacket, and stopped when he saw what I was doing. You're working, he said. Someone attempted to shoot through your office window this morning and I've been relocated to your private floor. The Aldecott accounts don't care. I didn't look up. Did Marchin get anything? A pause. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from the desk, my chair, technically, or the chair I had apparently inherited, and said, a vehicle. Partial plate. We're working on it. Professional. The angle suggests a high position. Elevated. Patient. He said it with the same flatness Marchin used, information stripped of its emotional content. Not a warning shot. I looked up then. He was watching me with that careful steadiness, gauging something, his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely linked between them, and I realized he was waiting for a reaction. Fear, perhaps. The reasonable human response to learning that a patient professional had aimed a rifle at a window I'd been standing at 12 hours after a gala where I had been visibly, publicly positioned as something worth aiming at. Reyes, I said. Something moved in his eyes. Possibly. He made me at the gala. Your hand on my back told everyone in that room what I meant to your operation. I held his gaze. Or what they thought I meant. The silence that followed was a different quality than the silences I was used to from him. Less controlled. More occupied. You're not leaving this floor, he said. Orion. Until we have the plate and the origin point and whoever gave the order, you are not leaving this floor. His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. That is not a negotiation. I have a job. You can do your job from here. He gestured at the desk, at my laptop, at the organized spread of files. You're already doing it. I looked at him sitting in my chair in his private sitting room, this man who had built walls around everything he valued and was now, with characteristic indirectness, building one around me, and I thought about the account number and my father's name and his thumb at the edge of my cheekbone and the door that had opened and closed too fast to be certain of what I'd seen. This isn't about security, I said quietly. He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. It's partly about security, he said finally. I laughed. It surprised both of us, a short, genuine sound that escaped before I could manage it, and something in his expression shifted in response, that hairline fracture again, the one that let the light through briefly. The corner of his mouth moved. There's a second bedroom, he said. Through the far door. Marin will have it ready by tonight. You have a second bedroom in your private wing. I have a thorough estate. I looked back at my laptop. I moved a file. I was very focused on the Aldecott accounts. The lines in this arrangement are becoming unclear. He stood. He straightened. He was very close to the desk when he did it, close enough that I could see the tiredness behind the steadiness in his eyes, the particular exhaustion of a man who has been running calculations since before dawn and has found, in all of them, the same unmanageable variable. Some lines, he said, have been unclear for a while. He left. The door clicked shut with the soft finality of an expensive thing closing properly, and I sat in his chair at his desk in his private wing in the clothes Marin had produced in my size, and I stared at the Aldecott accounts without reading a single word of them. The second bedroom was through the far door. I was aware, with great precision, of where the first one was. I gave myself 3 days. 3 days to acclimatize, to re-establish the professional geometry of our arrangement, to locate the boundaries that the last week had steadily eroded and reconstruct them somewhere defensible. 3 days of working from his sitting room desk with the door between us open, because he left it open, which I hadn't asked for and didn't address, of eating meals that Marin delivered with the quiet efficiency of someone who found nothing unusual about any of this, of sleeping in the second bedroom with the door closed and the city a distant amber sprawl through windows I was not supposed to stand near. On the fourth morning I wrote the memo. I did it properly. The way he did things, printed, considered, the language exact. I had spent an hour on it the night before while the estate settled into its nighttime quiet and Orion's light was still visible under the sitting room door, which I was also not addressing. I outlined, in clear professional terms, the conditions under which I was willing to continue the current arrangement. Separate workspaces. Defined hours. A return to my apartment by the end of the following week, security detail notwithstanding. Meals taken separately. And a reinstatement of the formal reporting structure that governed our working relationship, which meant decisions about my schedule, my presence, and my whereabouts required my input rather than simply my compliance. It was, I thought, entirely reasonable. I left it on the desk before he came in. He read it at 7:45. I was in the kitchen, his kitchen, the private one adjacent to the wing, another room I had been incrementally absorbing into my daily geography, when I heard him pick it up. I know because I was listening. I was also making coffee with great concentration, because concentration is a useful thing to perform when you are waiting for the reaction of a man whose reactions you have spent 2 years cataloging and still cannot fully predict. He appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:52. He had the memo in his hand. He set it on the counter beside the coffee machine with the same deliberate placement he used for everything, and he looked at me, and he said nothing for long enough that I turned from the machine to face him because the silence had a texture I didn't recognize and I wanted to see his face. He looked, and this was unexpected, this was not in any version of my prediction, almost amused. Not smiled. Orion didn't smile the way other people smiled, easily and often. But there was something in the set of his expression that was lighter than usual, a quality of a man who has seen something that confirmed a suspicion he'd been carrying privately for some time. Separate workspaces, he said. Yes. You're currently in my kitchen. I'm making coffee. In my kitchen. In my wing. At my machine. He tilted his head slightly. Separate from what, exactly, Lyra? I picked up my coffee. From you. You've been in my sitting room for 4 days. You know where Marin keeps the extra blankets and which shelf has the bourbon I actually drink versus the one I offer to guests. You reorganized my filing system yesterday and you did it better than it was, and you know that I know that. He hadn't moved from the doorway. He didn't need to. You're not separate. You've never been separate. That's the problem you're trying to solve with this document, and it won't work because the document can't solve it. Then what solves it? Admitting what it actually is. The coffee was too hot to drink and I held it anyway, something to keep my hands occupied, and I looked at him in the doorway in the morning light and tried to locate the version of myself who had walked into an interview 2 years ago and answered his questions with a steady, unimpressed composure that had apparently been the thing that made him hire me. That woman had known exactly where her edges were. She had maintained them with precision. She had not accounted for 7:52 in his kitchen on a Thursday with the memo on the counter between them. I need terms, I said. I need something that defines what this is so that I can function inside it. That's not weakness. That's how I operate. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed off the doorframe and came into the kitchen, which was not large, and stopped at the counter, one hand resting on the surface, the memo beneath his fingertips. He looked at it. He looked at me. All right, he said. Terms. I hadn't expected agreement. The unexpectedness of it made me cautious. You'll accept the separate workspace condition? No. I'll give you terms, he said. Mine. He turned to face me fully, and his eyes in the morning light were very dark and very direct and carrying the particular quality they got when he'd already made a decision and was now simply executing it. You stay on this floor until the security situation is resolved. Not negotiable. You work where you choose within the wing. I won't designate a space because we both know you'll use all of it regardless. The corner of his mouth moved. Your hours are your own. Meals are when you want them and where you want them, and Marin will accommodate whatever you decide. You keep access to everything you currently have access to. I waited. There was more. There was always more with Orion. And? I said. And you stop pretending, he said, that the memo was about workspace. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window the morning was doing something gray and soft over the city, the kind of light that flattened distances and made everything feel closer than it was. He was close. He had entered the room and positioned himself with his characteristic certainty and was now simply present in the way he was always present, completely, without apology, taking up exactly the space he intended to take up and not 1 inch more or less. You belong here, he said quietly. Not the possessive snap of the hallway. Not an order. Something older and more exposed than either of those things. That's the only term that matters to me. The rest I'll negotiate. That's not a term. That's a declaration. Yes, he said. It is. I set my coffee down. I picked up the memo. I held it for a moment, this careful document with its careful language and its reasonable, defensible conditions, and I was aware of how much work had gone into it and how completely beside the point it was and had perhaps always been. I folded it once. I set it back on the counter. I want access to the 7742 account, I said. Full access. No more gaps in the ledgers. Something moved in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or its close neighbor, respect. Done. And I choose where I eat. I already said that. I want to hear it again. You choose where you eat, Lyra. I picked up my coffee. I looked at him over the rim of it, this man in his kitchen in his wing in his house with his hand on the counter and his eyes on mine and 2 years of accumulated everything pressing against the inside of the room like a tide against glass. Your terms are very thin, I told him. I only needed one, he said. The call came at 3 in the morning. I know because my phone screen lit the ceiling of the second bedroom white, and I had not been asleep, which meant I saw the time before I saw the number, and the number was one I didn't recognize, which was how I knew it was serious. Unknown numbers at 3 a.m. in Orion Crow's world did not carry good news. They carried the kind of information that required the cover of dark and the deniability of an unregistered line. I answered before the second pulse. The voice was Volkov's. Quieter than the Vigneto Club, stripped of its afternoon courtesy, carrying the flat precision of someone delivering intelligence rather than conducting a conversation. He spoke for 90 seconds. I listened without interrupting, which took considerable effort, because what he was telling me rearranged the architecture of the last 72 hours in a way that made my chest go cold and my mind go very, very fast. The name he'd given me at the Vigneto Club was correct. The contract on my life was real. But the intermediary, the routing, the chain of instruction, didn't end with Reyes. It ended closer. I was out of bed before he'd finished the sentence. Orion's bedroom door was closed. I had never opened it. In all the weeks of the private wing and the second bedroom and the incremental dissolution of every professional boundary I had carefully constructed, that door had remained a line I hadn't crossed, the last architectural distinction between what we were and what we hadn't yet named. I knocked twice and opened it without waiting because there was no longer time for the courtesies of ambiguity. He was awake. I understood later that he had probably not slept either, that the forehead-to-forehead stillness of the evening had left him in the same suspended, unresolved state it had left me, but in the moment what I registered was that he was sitting at the edge of his bed in the dark with his elbows on his knees and his head up before I was fully through the door, alert with the instantaneous totality of a man whose nervous system had learned long ago that night interruptions were never incidental. He looked at my face. He stood up. What happened? Volkov called. I came fully into the room. The city through his windows was the same amber sprawl, the same indifferent geometry, and I stood in it and told him what Volkov had said in the same flat, sequential way I processed information under pressure, beginning to end, no editorializing, just the shape of it laid out between us like a map of something neither of us wanted to look at. When I finished he was very still. Say the name again, he said. I said it. The stillness deepened. It was not the stillness of surprise. Orion Crow had not survived the architecture of the city's underworld by being surprised by betrayal. It was something older and more interior, the stillness of a man absorbing a confirmation he had been, on some level, waiting for, and finding that confirmation no easier for having been anticipated. He moved to the window. His back to me, hands at his sides, the city below him like a thing he owned and was currently reconsidering. I watched him stand there and said nothing because there are moments that require silence and this was one of them and I had learned, from 2 years of proximity to this particular man, to recognize them. How long has Volkov known? He said finally. He didn't say. I didn't ask. I came to stand beside him at the window, not behind him, beside him, which felt important in a way I couldn't articulate and didn't try to. He said he could give us documentation. A full chain. Enough to act on. Why? Because Rhea's moving on Crow territory destabilizes something Volkov has interests in. The enemy of his enemy. I paused. And I think because he wanted to see what I'd do with it. Orion looked at me sideways. Something moved in his expression. He's testing the Crow operation through you. He's been testing it since the gala. Since he saw your hand on my back and recalibrated his assessment of what I am to you. I held his eyes. He's not wrong to. I recalibrated mine. The window held our reflections faintly, two pale shapes against the city light, and I watched his reflection watch mine for a moment before he turned away from the glass entirely and faced the room, faced me, in the full dark of 3 a.m. with the information between us and the door still open behind me. I owe you an apology, he said. It was so unexpected that I didn't respond immediately. Orion Crow operated on the principle that apology was a form of debt acknowledgement and debt was something you settled, not discussed. In 2 years I had never heard him produce the word in reference to himself. The meeting with Volkov, he said. I accused you of a unilateral decision. What you made was a judgment call in an information vacuum I created by not telling you everything I knew about the threat landscape. His jaw was set but his eyes were direct, carrying the particular quality they got when he had decided to be precise about something difficult. The 7742 account wasn't the only thing I kept from you. I knew there was a secondary interest in the contract. I didn't tell you because I was managing it. You were protecting me. I was controlling the information. There's a difference and I knew it and I did it anyway. He stopped. You went to Volkov because I'd left you blind. That's on me. The room was very quiet. Outside, something in the city, a siren, distant, becoming distant, rose and fell and disappeared. I stood in Orion Crow's bedroom at 3 a.m. listening to him dismantle his own position with the same precision he used to dismantle everything else, and I felt something in the complicated architecture of what I carried for this man shift irrevocably into a configuration I was no longer going to pretend I didn't recognize. The name Volkov gave me, I said. We need to move before morning. If they know the contract has been traced. Marchin is already on it. He said it quietly. I called him when you were still talking. I stared at him. I was telling you the information in real time. And it was actionable in real time. Waiting until you finished to respond to it would have been sentimentality over strategy. The corner of his mouth moved, that fraction of expression that was as close as he came. You taught me that, actually. The Veltri correspondence. Act on the data, not the narrative. I laughed. Again, the short genuine sound that surprised both of us, and this time he let it change his face more than usual, the fracture wider, the light through it warmer, and we stood in his bedroom in the dark 3 weeks after a bullet through his office window and 7 years after my father's name on a document, and I looked at him and understood with complete and unceremonious clarity that there was no version of my life, going forward, that made sense without this man in it at close range. I verified the name, I said. Independently. Before Volkov called. I didn't tell you because I wanted to be certain before I gave you something you'd act on. He looked at me. You were protecting me. I was controlling the information. I held his gaze. There's a difference. And I knew it. The silence that followed was not the silence of the standoff or the kitchen or the hallway. It was the silence of two people who have stopped pretending, simultaneously, by accident, and are standing in the aftermath of it without a single remaining structure to hide behind. He crossed the room in 3 steps. His hands came up to frame my face, both of them this time, and his eyes held mine from a distance of inches with an expression that had no management left in it at all. Lyra, he said. Just that. Just my name, in his voice, at 3 a.m, which turned out to be sufficient. I reached up and covered his hands with mine. Tell me the rest of what you know, I said. All of it. No gaps. All of it, he said. No gaps. And for the first time in 2 years, Orion Crow told me everything. They took me on a Tuesday. I know this because Tuesdays were the one morning I left the estate alone, a concession Orion had made 3 weeks after the forehead-to-forehead night, after Marchin had verified the Volkov intelligence and the name it produced had been dealt with in the quiet, irreversible way Orion dealt with things that threatened what he valued. The security situation was resolved, officially. The detail had been scaled back. And I had reinstated my Tuesday morning walk to the coffee shop on Vela Street because I needed one thing, one small ordinary thing, that existed outside the gravitational field of Orion Crow and belonged entirely to me. He had agreed. He hadn't liked it, but he had agreed, which was its own form of progress, the kind we didn't discuss directly but both understood. The coffee shop was 4 blocks from the estate. I made it to the second block. There were 2 of them, which was professional, one in front, one flanking, the approach time to a gap in the foot traffic that didn't happen by accident. I recognized the coordination before I recognized the danger, my mind logging it as tactics before it logged it as something happening to me personally, and by the time the personal part arrived the van door was already open and the choice had already been made for me. I didn't scream. There was no point in screaming. I memorized the route instead. The room they put me in was underground. I knew by the quality of the silence, the particular density of it that happens below street level, and by the absence of city sound, which in this city was as distinctive as a fingerprint. Concrete walls. A drain in the floor that I didn't examine too closely. A single light source overhead, the industrial kind, which meant warehouse or converted basement, which meant the Port District or the Aldecott Industrial Corridor, both of which were Reyes-adjacent territory. Reyes was dead. Orion had seen to that personally, which meant whoever had sprung this particular trap was working from Reyes's infrastructure without Reyes's authorization, which meant they were opportunistic rather than strategic, which meant they were more dangerous in the short term and less dangerous in the long term, because opportunists make errors that strategists don't. I sat down on the floor with my back to the wall and I thought about Orion finding the Tuesday gap in my detail and I thought about the way he'd looked at me when he agreed to it, that fractional hesitation, the jaw set once and then released, the decision made against his own preference because I had asked for it, and I thought about what his face would look like when Marchin told him. I didn't let myself stay with that image for long. I needed to think. What I didn't know, and learned later in pieces, from Orion, from Marchin, from the particular silences between their words that told me as much as the words themselves, was what happened on the other side of my Tuesday morning. Marchin called at 8:47. Orion was in his ground floor office, first coffee, the quiet before the working day assembled itself around him. He listened to Marchin for 11 seconds. Then he put the phone down and stood up and became something that the people in that building had not seen before, which was notable, because the people in that building had seen considerable things. He pulled every active resource. Not selectively, every asset, every contact, every thread of obligation and leverage and debt that the Crow operation had accumulated across 15 years of careful, patient empire building. He called people who had not heard from him in years and who answered immediately because that was the nature of the call, the number, the voice on the other end of it. He called people he had specifically avoided calling because the cost of their assistance would be significant and the payment would be complicated, and he had always, previously, assessed that cost against the value of the outcome. The assessment this time was not complicated. He pulled everything. He spent everything. 15 years of carefully hoarded leverage, discharged in a single morning like a man who has decided that the currency was only ever worth what it could buy and has finally found the thing worth buying. Marchin told me later, with the careful neutrality of a man choosing his words for maximum precision, that he had never seen Orion Crow operate without a contingency. That the defining characteristic of his leadership, across every crisis Marchin had witnessed, was the layered redundancy of his planning, the fallback position, the alternative route, the preserved option. He always kept something in reserve. On that Tuesday he kept nothing. They found me in 6 hours. The Aldecott corridor, as I had assessed. A converted basement beneath a shipping logistics office that existed on paper and nowhere else, which Orion's financial people identified through the account routing I had memorized from the 7,742 files, the same numbers, the debt and the ledger and the architecture of everything that had brought me into this man's orbit in the first place, now serving as the map that brought him to a concrete room with a drain in the floor on a Tuesday afternoon. I heard them before I saw them. Not the men Orion sent first, who were quiet by profession and arrived like weather. You only knew they'd been there by what changed afterward. But Orion himself, whose footsteps I knew by now in the way I knew my own pulse, that unhurried, certain cadence that had been my daily geography for 2 years, coming down a corridor that smelled of salt water and cold concrete. The door opened. He stood in it, and I stood up, and we looked at each other across the length of that terrible room, and his face was not the controlled surface, not the calculation, not the careful studied composure that I had catalogued across 1,000 ordinary moments. It was none of those things. It was what lived underneath all of those things, the thing I had seen briefly in the lamplight and the kitchen and at 3 in the morning, except now there was nothing brief about it and nothing hidden. He crossed the room. His hands found my face. He looked at me with the thoroughness of a man conducting an inventory of something he had believed, for 6 hours, he might not see again, and the looking was so unguarded and so entirely without management that I felt it like a physical weight, the full measure of what he carried for me, no longer deniable by either of us. "I'm all right," I said. "I know." His voice was rough in a way I had never heard it. I needed to see it. I reached up and covered his hands with mine, the mirror of 3 in the morning, the gesture that had become ours without either of us deciding it. His forehead came down to mine. His eyes closed. We stayed like that in the concrete room while his team moved around us with professional discretion, and I thought about the red dress and the hallway and the memo and the bourbon and my father's name and every room in that estate that I had incrementally inhabited until there was no remaining space that didn't account for me, and I understood, standing in the worst room I had ever been in, that this was not obsession wearing the costume of love. This was just love. Wearing its own face, finally, without anything over it. "Take me home," I said. He pulled back enough to look at me. Something moved in his eyes, warm and certain and entirely undisguised. "Yes," he said. And he did. The estate was different when we got back. Not structurally, the marble was the same, the chandeliers, the particular quality of expensive silence that had been my daily atmosphere for 2 years. But something in the air had changed in the way air changes after a storm passes through, a clarity that comes from pressure released, from the atmosphere finally admitting what it had been building toward all along. I noticed it in the way the staff moved, not differently, exactly, but with a recalibrated awareness, a subtle adjustment in how they oriented to the two of us arriving together, Orion's hand at my back in the old familiar position that was no longer a performance of territory but simply the truth of where his hand belonged. I noticed it in myself, too. The thing about spending 6 hours in a concrete room with a drain in the floor is that it performs a certain clarifying function. The extraneous falls away. The things you had been negotiating with yourself about, the careful maintenance of distance, the professional architecture, the terms and the memos and the elaborate structure of not admitting, become very small against the simple fact of what remains when everything else is stripped out. What had remained, in that room, was Orion's footsteps in the corridor. The specific cadence of them. The way I had known them before I saw him. That was not a professional relationship. That had not been a professional relationship for some time. The first thing I did when we got back was go to my office. Not the sitting room desk, not the second bedroom, not any of the third-floor geography I had incrementally colonized over the weeks of forced proximity. My office. The one on the main floor, with the glass wall and the view of his office across the open floor plan, with my files and my system and the chair that knew the specific geometry of 2 years of long evenings. Orion followed me to the doorway. He stood in it the way he always stood in doorways, filling them without crowding them, and watched me move through the space with an expression that had not fully reassembled itself from the concrete room and showed no immediate signs of doing so. I sat down. I opened my laptop. I pulled up the 7742 account, full access, as agreed, no gaps, and I looked at the numbers for a long moment, the full architecture of the debt, the settlement, the 18 months of cleared ledger that he had never mentioned. Then I opened a new document and I began to type. He waited. He was patient in the way of someone who has learned that interrupting me mid-thought produces worse outcomes than waiting, which was one of the things 2 years had taught him about me, one of the small accumulated knowledges that constituted, in their totality, being known by another person. When I finished, I turned the laptop to face him. He read it. His eyes moved across the screen with the focused efficiency he brought to documents that mattered, and when he reached the bottom he was still for a moment, and then he looked up at me. "You're restructuring the operational accounts," he said. "I'm restructuring my role." I held his gaze. The secretary position no longer reflects the actual scope of work I perform, the information I have access to, or the decisions I am functionally making within this operation. I kept my voice level and precise because this was important and I wanted it said clearly. I've drafted a revised remit. Chief of Operations. Equals signatory authority on the primary accounts. A seat at the table for any decision that affects the organization's strategic direction. A pause. And a salary that reflects the fact that I have known where the bodies are buried for 2 years and have not, to date, mentioned them to anyone. The corner of his mouth moved. That last point is called loyalty. That last point is called leverage, and we both know it, and I have chosen not to use it as leverage, which is a distinction that deserves compensation. I closed the laptop. Those are my terms. He looked at me across my desk in my office for a long moment, and the expression on his face was the open one, the unmanaged one, the one that had stopped being rare sometime around 3 in the morning and had not returned to being rare since. "Done," he said. "You didn't negotiate." "No. You always negotiate." "I'm aware." He pushed off the doorframe and came into the office, and stopped in front of the desk, and looked at me the way he had looked at me in the concrete room, with that inventory quality, the thoroughness of a man accounting for something he values at its actual worth. "The terms are fair. The terms are, in fact, overdue. And I am not going to negotiate with you over your own worth, Lyra. That's the one thing in this operation I refuse to treat as a line item." The office was quiet around us. Outside the glass wall the estate moved in its ordinary rhythms, Marin somewhere conducting the administration of the household, security running the rotation, the machinery of the Crow operation reassembling itself after a Tuesday that had cost it considerably. It would rebuild. It always rebuilt. That was the nature of what Orion had constructed, not a structure that depended on any single element remaining stable, but a system that absorbed pressure and redistributed it and continued. I understood, looking at my desk and my files and the restructured document on my screen, that I was part of that system now. Not a satellite of it. Not an asset within it. A load-bearing element, which was a different thing entirely. "There's one more item," I said. He waited. "The debt." I folded my hands on the desk. "My father's. The original account, the settlement, all of it." I had thought about how to say this and had decided, in the end, that the only way to say it was plainly. "I'm repaying it." Something moved in his face. "Lyra. Not to you. It's already settled, you said so, and I believe you." I held his gaze. "I'm repaying it to the operation. Formally. A documented contribution against the original principal, structured as a founding equity stake in the restructured entity." I paused. "Which means the debt that brought me here becomes the mechanism by which I own a share of what's here. The ledger closes. We start clean." He stared at me. It was, I realized, the first time I had seen Orion Crow look at something he genuinely hadn't anticipated, and the expression it produced was extraordinary, the full weight of his attention without any of its management, something that was almost wonder, if wonder were a thing that existed in the vocabulary of a man like this. "You turned the debt into equity," he said. "The debt was always going to be the foundation of something," I said. "I just decided what." He came around the desk. I stood, because the moment required it, and he stood in front of me with the city at his back through the glass wall and his eyes on mine with that open, unguarded certainty, and he reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who had only ever seen him in a boardroom or across an interrogation table. "Not my secretary," he said quietly. "No. My equal." "At minimum," I said. He laughed. A real one, low and warm, the kind I had heard perhaps 4 times in 2 years and had been, each time, entirely unprepared for the way it changed his face. It changed his face now. It made him look like a man who had gotten, against considerable odds and by a route neither of them had planned, exactly where he was supposed to be. He pressed his lips to my forehead. "Welcome to the operation, Miss Solari," he said against my hairline. I tilted my face up. "Show me the books, Mr. Crow." And he did. All of them. Every ledger, every account, every shadow and secret and carefully buried truth that constituted the full architecture of Orion Crow's world. He showed me everything, and I stood beside him in the amber light of the estate and I looked at it all, and it was vast and complicated and morally intricate and entirely, irrevocably mine. Not because he had given it to me. Because I had earned it. Line by line, ledger by ledger, red dress and bourbon and concrete room and all. The ghost was gone. What stood in her place knew exactly where she was.